The train whistle pierced the still Nebraska air as Rebecca Morgan clutched her worn leather case to her chest, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone around her could hear it. The year was 1878, and she had traveled over 1,000 miles from Boston to marry a man she'd never met, a man who'd promised her a new life in the untamed frontier town of Whispering Pines. Rebecca stepped onto the weathered platform, her legs trembling after days of travel. Dust swirled around her ankles as she scanned the faces of those waiting at the station. The advertisement had been clear. Successful rancher seeks God-fearing woman of good character for marriage, must be willing to work hard and build a life in the West. She had responded with a carefully written letter in her daguerreotype, and Mr. Harold Wilcox had sent money for her passage west. Miss Morgan, a tall man with a graying mustache and an expensive coat, approached her. "I'm Harold Wilcox." Rebecca managed a small nod, her throat too tight to speak properly. "Why, yes, sir, it's a pleasure to meet you." Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Harold frowned, leaning closer. "Pardon, miss, you'll have to speak up." "It's a pleasure to meet you," she repeated, forcing her voice louder though it cracked with the effort. Harold studied her with narrowing eyes, circling her once. "You're smaller than your photograph suggested, and quieter too." He crossed his arms. "Can you cook, manage a household?" "Yes, sir. I managed my father's household after my mother passed." "I can speak up, girl, I can hardly hear you," he interrupted, irritation evident in his voice. Rebecca felt heat rushing to her cheeks as several bystanders turned to watch. "I can cook and keep house," she said, straining to be heard. "This won't do at all," Harold muttered, shaking his head. "Miss Morgan, I run the largest ranch in the county. I host business dinners, entertain important guests. I need a wife who can be the voice of my household when required." He sighed heavily. "You're far too timid for such a role." Rebecca's stomach plummeted. "Sir, I'm sorry you've come all this way for nothing," Harold said, already backing away. "There's a women's boarding house on Elm Street. Mrs. Peterson runs it. Tell her I sent you and I'll cover a week's board. That should give you time to arrange return passage east." Before Rebecca could respond, Harold Wilcox had turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone on the platform, her single case at her feet, and the curious stares of strangers burning into her. The boarding house was a simple 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. Mrs. Peterson, a round woman with sharp eyes, showed Rebecca to a tiny room on the second floor after hearing her situation. "Not the first time Wilcox has sent a girl here," she commented. "Man thinks he's getting one thing, changes his mind when he sees another. Don't take it personally, dear." But Rebecca did take it personally. She had spent the last of her savings on proper clothes for her new life. Her father had died last winter, leaving nothing but debts, and their small home had been sold to satisfy creditors. There was nothing to return to in Boston. That evening, Rebecca sat in the boarding house parlor, a piece of paper before her, as she calculated what little money remained in her purse. Not enough for a ticket home, and certainly not enough to stay in Whispering Pines indefinitely. "You're going to wear a hole in that paper," a woman's voice said. Rebecca looked up to see another boarder, an older woman with silver-streaked dark hair and kind eyes. "I'm Martha Gaines," the woman said, settling into the chair across from Rebecca. "Mrs. Peterson mentioned your situation." "Rebecca Morgan," she replied softly. "You don't have money to go back east, do you?" Martha asked directly. Rebecca shook her head, embarrassment washing over her. "Then you'll need work. I run the mercantile in town with my husband. We could use help stocking shelves and keeping the books in order. It won't pay much, but it might keep you fed while you figure things out." The next morning, Rebecca reported to Gaines Mercantile. The shop was larger than she expected, stocked with everything from nails to fabric to canned goods. Mr. Gaines, a balding man with a friendly smile, showed her the storeroom and explained the inventory system. The work was straightforward enough, though Rebecca found herself freezing whenever customers approached her with questions. She would stammer through responses, her voice so quiet that people often asked her to repeat herself. By the end of the first week, she had overheard Mr. Gaines discussing her with his wife. "The girl's smart enough, keeps good records, but she can hardly speak to the customers," he'd said. Nearly frightened Mrs. Jenkins when she jumped like a startled rabbit after being asked about lamp oil. "Give her time, George," Martha had replied. "Not everyone takes to new places easily." Rebecca was determined to prove herself useful. She arrived early each morning, stayed late to ensure the ledgers balanced perfectly, and gradually learned to anticipate what items needed restocking before they ran out. But speaking to strangers remained a torment, and she often retreated to the storeroom when the shop grew busy. 2 weeks after her arrival in Whispering Pines, Rebecca was organizing a shipment of fabric when the shop bell jingled. Through the storeroom doorway, she saw a tall man enter, his broad shoulders nearly filling the frame. He removed his hat, revealing sun-streaked brown hair and a face tanned from outdoor work. Martha greeted him warmly. "Morning, Jake. What brings you to town today?" "Supply run," he answered, his voice deep but quiet. "Need some fence wire, nails, coffee, and whatever letters might have come for the Diamond R." "Rebecca, could you fetch the mail for Mr. Reed?" Martha called. Rebecca emerged hesitantly from the storeroom, her eyes downcast as she moved behind the counter to the mail cubby. She could feel the man watching her as she sorted through the stack, finally extracting 2 envelopes marked for Diamond R Ranch and J. Reed. "Here you are, sir," she murmured, placing them on the counter without quite meeting his eyes. The man, Jake Reed, didn't immediately take the letters. When Rebecca finally glanced up, she found herself looking into the clearest blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a weathered face that seemed neither friendly nor unfriendly, just watchful. "Thank you," he said simply, taking the envelopes and tucking them into his coat pocket. Martha bustled over. "Jake, this is Rebecca Morgan. She's new in town." "Rebecca, this is Jake Reed. He runs the Diamond R Ranch about 10 miles west of here." Jake nodded in acknowledgement but said nothing more. Rebecca managed a small nod in return, relieved when he turned his attention back to Martha and his supply list. For the next hour, Rebecca busied herself with inventory while Martha helped Jake gather his supplies. The man spoke little, answering Martha's questions with minimal words, his expression remaining unreadable. When he finally paid for his purchases and loaded them onto his wagon, Rebecca felt herself relaxing, as though a tension she hadn't fully recognized had left with him. "Jake's one of our most reliable customers," Martha commented after he'd gone. "Keeps to himself mostly, but he's fair in his dealings and his ranch hands are always well behaved when they come to town, which is more than I can say for some outfits." Rebecca nodded, not knowing how to respond. There was something about Jake Reed that had made her even more tongue-tied than usual, something in those quiet, assessing eyes that had seemed to see right through her. The days settled into a pattern. Rebecca worked at the Mercantile 6 days a week, returning to her small room at the boarding house each evening to eat a solitary meal before reading by candlelight until sleep claimed her. On Sundays, she attended church, sitting in the back pew and slipping out before anyone could engage her in conversation. 3 weeks after her first meeting with Jake Reed, he returned to the Mercantile. This time, Rebecca was alone in the shop, Mr. and Mrs. Gaines having gone to help a neighbor whose barn had caught fire in the night. The bell jangled, and Rebecca looked up from the ledger to see Jake ducking through the doorway. Her pulse quickened as she closed the book. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she managed, her voice barely audible even in the quiet shop. He nodded, hat already in his hands. "Miss Morgan." He remembered her name. The realization sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "How may I help you today?" she asked, forcing herself to maintain eye contact, though it made her heart race. Jake approached the counter slowly, as if sensing her discomfort. "Just picking up an order. George said it would be ready today." Rebecca nodded, grateful for something concrete to do. "Yes, Mr. Gaines mentioned it before he left. One moment, please." She retreated to the storeroom, finding the crate labeled Reed on a shelf. It was heavier than she expected, and she struggled to lift it. Suddenly, Jake was there, his tall frame filling the storeroom doorway. "Let me," he said simply, crossing to her in 2 strides. He lifted the crate effortlessly, his sleeve brushing against her arm as he did. Rebecca stepped back quickly, bumping into a shelf and sending a tin of buttons clattering to the floor. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, dropping to her knees to gather the scattered buttons. To her surprise, Jake set down the crate and knelt across from her, his large, calloused hands carefully picking up buttons and placing them in her outstretched palm. They worked in silence until every button was recovered. "Thank you," Rebecca said softly as they both stood. Jake merely nodded, retrieving his crate and carrying it to the counter. As Rebecca recorded the transaction in the ledger, she was acutely aware of his presence, the steady way he breathed, the faint scent of horses and open air that clung to his clothes. "Will there be anything else today?" she asked when the entry was complete. Jake hesitated, seeming to consider something. "Do you have any books?" The question surprised her. "Books, we have a small selection. What sort are you looking for?" "Anything," he said. "Winter's coming, nights get long." Rebecca moved to a small shelf in the corner where the mercantile kept a modest collection of books. "We have some Dickens, a volume of Shakespeare, a few penny dreadfuls." She glanced at him. "Do you have any preferences?" Jake shrugged. "Something with substance. Not those dime novels about Wild West heroes." Rebecca's fingers trailed over the spines before selecting a well-bound volume. "Perhaps this. It's The Last of the Mohicans. It's about frontier life, but it's well written." She handed him the book, and their fingers brushed momentarily. Jake opened it, scanning a few pages before nodding. "I'll take it." After paying for his purchases, Jake loaded the crate onto his wagon. Rebecca watched through the window as he secured it, then returned to the shop door. "Miss Morgan," he said, pausing in the doorway, "thank you for your help today." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving Rebecca with the strange feeling that something significant had just occurred, though she couldn't have said what. The following Saturday, Rebecca was sweeping the mercantile porch when she spotted Jake Reed's wagon approaching. Her heart skipped as she watched him guide his team to a halt before the hitching post. "Morning, Miss Morgan," he said, tipping his hat as he secured the horses. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Inside the mercantile, Martha greeted Jake warmly while Rebecca retreated to her usual spot near the ledger. She tried to focus on her work, but found her attention repeatedly drawn to Jake as he moved through the store, methodically gathering supplies. When he approached the counter to pay, he placed The Last of the Mohicans beside his purchases. "Finished already?" Martha asked, picking up the book. "Read it twice," Jake replied. "Good recommendation." His eyes shifted briefly to Rebecca. "Would you like something else?" Rebecca asked before she could stop herself. Jake nodded. "If you have any suggestions." Martha glanced between them with interest. "Rebecca reads more than anyone I've ever met. She's the one who organized our book corner." Rebecca felt her cheeks warm under Martha's praise and Jake's steady gaze. "I could show you what else we have," she offered quietly. For the next 15 minutes, Rebecca guided Jake through the store's modest collection, describing each book in soft, halting sentences. He listened attentively, asking occasional questions that required more than one-word answers. It was the longest conversation she'd had with anyone since arriving in Whispering Pines. Jake eventually selected Moby Dick, paying for it along with his other supplies. "It's quite long," Rebecca warned as she wrapped the book in brown paper. "Long winter ahead," Jake replied. Then, almost hesitantly, he added, "I liked hearing your thoughts on the books." Before Rebecca could process this unexpected comment, he had gathered his purchases and departed, leaving her with a curious lightness in her chest. That evening at the boarding house, Mrs. Peterson delivered unexpected news as Rebecca sat down to dinner. "I'll be needing your room next week," she announced without preamble. "My sister's coming to stay and she'll need proper accommodations." Rebecca's fork clattered against her plate. "Of course, I understand. I'll make other arrangements." But as she returned to her room later, Rebecca confronted the reality of her situation. She had nowhere else to go. Her wages from the mercantile were barely enough to cover her board, with precious little saved. The other boarding houses in town were either full or beyond her means. Sunday morning found Rebecca in the back pew of the small white church, her mind too preoccupied with her housing dilemma to focus on Reverend Thompson's sermon. As the congregation filed out after the service, Martha Gaines intercepted her. "Rebecca, dear, you look troubled. Is everything all right?" The genuine concern in Martha's voice broke through Rebecca's reserve, and she found herself explaining her situation in hushed tones on the church steps. Martha frowned. "That won't do at all. Let me speak with George. We have a small room above the storeroom. It's nothing fancy, mind you, just a bed and a bureau, but you're welcome to it until you find something more suitable." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose—" "Nonsense," Martha interrupted gently. "You're a hard worker, and it would be convenient having someone on the premises. The room's just gathering dust otherwise." By Tuesday, Rebecca had moved her few belongings into the small attic room above the mercantile storeroom. True to Martha's description, it was modest, barely large enough for the narrow bed and battered bureau, but it was clean, and the small window offered a view of the mountains in the distance. That Saturday brought Jake Reed back to the mercantile. Rebecca was arranging a display of tinware when he entered, and she nearly dropped a pot at the sight of him. "Miss Morgan," he greeted her with a nod. "Mr. Reed, how did you find Moby Dick?" she asked, surprised at her own boldness. A hint of a smile touched his lips, dense, but worth the effort. Rebecca found herself returning his almost smile. Many feel that way about it. Jake completed his usual shopping, adding a few extra items: coffee, sugar, dried apples to his standard order. As Rebecca tallied his purchases, he reached into his coat and produced Moby Dick. "Have any recommendations for my next read?" he asked. They spent several minutes at the book corner again, with Rebecca growing marginally more comfortable as they discussed the merits of various volumes. Jake eventually selected The Count of Monte Cristo. "It's about a man unjustly imprisoned who escapes and reinvents himself," Rebecca explained, her voice growing slightly stronger as she spoke about something she loved. "It's quite thrilling, actually." "Sounds fitting for the territory," Jake commented. "Many out here are reinventing themselves too." His observation struck Rebecca deeply. Wasn't that what she had hoped to do by coming west? To transform from the invisible, overlooked daughter of a failed Boston businessman into a respected rancher's wife. "Yes," she agreed softly. "I suppose they are." As Jake prepared to leave, he hesitated by the counter. "Miss Morgan, I noticed you at church on Sunday. Do you usually attend?" Rebecca nodded. "Yes, every week. I typically ride in for services when weather permits," he said. "Perhaps I'll see you tomorrow." With that, he departed, leaving Rebecca to wonder at the strange, fluttering sensation in her chest. True to his word, Jake appeared at church the next morning. Rebecca, in her usual back pew, watched as he entered and removed his hat, his tall frame easily visible among the congregation. To her surprise, after nodding to a few acquaintances, he made his way directly to her pew and gestured to the empty space beside her. "May I?" he asked quietly. Rebecca nodded, sliding slightly to make room. They sat in silence as the church filled around them, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. There was something reassuring about Jake's solid presence beside her, the faint scent of shaving soap mingling with the ever-present smell of horses and open air. Throughout the service, Rebecca was acutely aware of him, the way he sang hymns in a deep, slightly off-key voice. How he listened intently to Reverend Thompson's sermon with a slight furrow between his brows, the careful way he handled the worn hymnal, as though respecting its age and purpose. When the service ended, they filed out together. On the church steps, Jake turned to her. "Do you have plans for dinner, Miss Morgan?" The question caught her completely off guard. No, I usually eat alone in my room. Would you consider joining me at the hotel restaurant?" "They serve a decent Sunday dinner." Rebecca hesitated, her heart racing. It wasn't proper for an unmarried woman to dine alone with a man she barely knew, and yet something about Jake Reed's straightforward manner made the invitation seem perfectly reasonable. "I should change first," she said finally, glancing down at her church dress. "Of course. Shall I meet you there at 1 o'clock? Rebecca nodded, then watched as Jake tipped his hat and strode toward his horse, his confident movements at odds with his quiet demeanor. At precisely 1 o'clock, Rebecca entered the Whispering Pines Hotel restaurant, her palms damp with nervousness. She had changed into her second-best dress, a navy blue cotton with a white collar, and had spent an inordinate amount of time pinning and repinning her light brown hair. Jake was already seated at a corner table. He rose when he saw her, pulling out her chair with an awkward formality that suggested he wasn't accustomed to such social niceties. "Thank you for joining me," he said as they settled across from each other. "Thank you for the invitation," Rebecca replied, focusing on smoothing her napkin across her lap to avoid meeting his eyes directly. The waiter arrived to take their order, roast beef with potatoes and greens for both of them, and then they were alone again, the silence stretching between them. "Have you started the Count of Monte Cristo?" Rebecca finally asked, grasping for a familiar topic. Jake nodded. "Read the first few chapters last night. The betrayal is hard to stomach." "It gets worse before it gets better," Rebecca warned, "but Dance is remarkably resilient." "Most have to be to survive injustice," Jake observed. After a pause, he added, "How long have you been in Whispering Pines now?" "Almost 6 weeks," Rebecca answered, surprised to realize how quickly the time had passed. "And before that, you're not from the West originally." It wasn't a question. Rebecca hesitated, then gave him the simplest version of her story: her father's death, the financial difficulties, the advertisement that had brought her west, and Harold Wilcox's rejection. She left out the humiliation she'd felt standing alone on the platform and how close she'd come to complete destitution. Jake listened without interruption, his expression darkening when she mentioned Wilcox. "He's a fool," Jake said when she finished, the hardness in his voice taking her by surprise. "Pardon, Wilcox, judging you without knowing you because you're quiet." Jake shook his head. "Some of the best people I've known hardly said a word." The waiter returned with their meals, giving Rebecca a moment to collect herself. No one had ever defended her quietness before. Her father had constantly urged her to speak up, girl, while her mother, before her death, had fretted about Rebecca's social disadvantages. Even in school, teachers had mistaken her silence for dullness until her written work proved otherwise. As they ate, Jake gradually drew out more of Rebecca's story: her childhood in Boston, her love of books, her skill with numbers. In turn, he shared bits of his own history. Born in Missouri, moved west after the war, worked as a ranch hand before saving enough to buy his own small spread 10 years ago. "It's not much compared to Wilcox's operation," Jake admitted. 2,000 acres, 100 head of cattle. "But it's mine, free and clear." "That sounds substantial to me," Rebecca said. "You must be very proud." Jake shrugged, but she could see the pride in his eyes. "It's good land, plenty of water, decent grazing. The house needs work, but it's solid." By the time they finished their apple pie, Rebecca realized they had talked for almost 2 hours, or rather, she had talked more than she had in weeks, while Jake listened attentively, offering occasional comments or questions that kept the conversation flowing. Outside the hotel, Jake hesitated. "I'd be happy to walk you back to the Mercantile." Rebecca nodded, and they strolled side by side down the main street, their pace unhurried. Several townspeople nodded greetings, a few casting curious glances at the pair. At the Mercantile's side door, which led to her attic room, Jake stopped. "Thank you for your company today, Miss Morgan." "Thank you for inviting me," Rebecca replied softly. "I enjoyed our conversation." Jake studied her for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Would it be all right if I sat with you again next Sunday, at church?" A warm feeling spread through Rebecca's chest. "Yes, I'd like that," Jake nodded, satisfied. "Until then." He tipped his hat and turned to go, then paused. "Actually, I'll be in town on Wednesday for a meeting with the Cattlemen's Association. Perhaps we could have coffee afterward. If you're not too busy at the store." "I'd like that too," Rebecca said, her voice steadier than she expected. As she watched Jake walk away, Rebecca realized she was smiling, a real smile that reached all the way to her eyes for the first time since arriving in Whispering Pines. Wednesday couldn't come quickly enough. Rebecca found herself watching the clock as it crept toward 5 o'clock when the mercantile closed and Jake's meeting was scheduled to end. "You look positively fidgety today," Martha observed as they straightened shelves late in the afternoon. Expecting something special, Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Reed mentioned he might stop by after his meeting for coffee." Martha's eyebrows rose, but her smile was knowing. "Did he now?" "Well, that explains why you've checked your hair in the window reflection at least 10 times today." "I have not," Rebecca protested weakly, though she knew it was true. At 5 minutes past 5, the bell above the door jingled and Jake entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. He wore a clean shirt under his usual vest, Rebecca noticed, and appeared to have trimmed his beard. "Evening, Jake," Martha greeted him cheerfully. "Rebecca mentioned you might be stopping by." Jake nodded to Martha, but his eyes found Rebecca. "If you're still available for coffee, Miss Morgan." "Yes, of course," Rebecca replied, untying her work apron. "Martha, would you mind if I go on?" Martha interrupted with a wave. "George and I can finish closing up." Jake offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Rebecca placed her hand lightly upon it. The gesture felt both formal and intimate as they walked the short distance to the town's small cafe. Over coffee and slices of fresh bread with butter, they continued their conversation from Sunday. Jake described his morning meeting, tedious but necessary, while Rebecca shared stories about unusual customer requests at the mercantile. "Mrs. Holloway insisted we order her special tea from England," she said, finding herself growing more animated as Jake's attentive gaze encouraged her. "She claims it's the only thing that helps her sleep, but Martha says she's been requesting the same tea for 15 years and still complains about insomnia." Jake's laugh was unexpected, a deep, rich sound that transformed his serious face. "Sounds like my foreman, Pete. Swears by this liniment for his bad knee but limps just the same." As they talked, Rebecca noticed something curious. When speaking with Jake, her usual stuttering nervousness diminished. Perhaps it was his own economy with words that made her feel less self-conscious about her quiet nature, or maybe it was simply that he truly listened, rather than waiting impatiently for her to finish. "I should let you get back," Jake said eventually, glancing at the darkening sky outside. "I need to start for home before full dark." Outside the cafe, he paused. "I enjoyed this, Miss Morgan." "Rebecca," she said suddenly. "Please call me Rebecca." Something warmed in his eyes. "Rebecca," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "Then you must call me Jake." "Jake," she echoed softly. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded decisively. "I'll see you Sunday, Rebecca." As he walked toward the livery where his horse waited, Rebecca realized that for the first time since coming west, she was looking forward to something beyond merely surviving another day. Sunday became the anchor of Rebecca's week. Jake would arrive at church just before the service began, sliding into the back pew beside her with a quiet "Morning, Rebecca." Afterward, they would walk to the hotel restaurant for dinner, gradually sharing more of themselves with each passing week. Rebecca learned that Jake had fought for the Union during the war, though he spoke little of those years. He had an older sister in St. Louis whom he hadn't seen in a decade but corresponded with regularly. His ranch, the Diamond R, was named for his mother, Rose, who had died when he was 14. In turn, Jake learned about Rebecca's childhood in Boston, her love of music though she couldn't play, her skill with embroidery, and her dream of someday having a garden with flowers just for beauty, not only vegetables for practicality. Between Sundays, Jake began finding reasons to visit town more frequently. Sometimes it was legitimate business supplies needed, mail to collect, meetings to attend. Other times, his excuses were flimsier, checking on a special order that hadn't arrived, inquiring about a book that he'd already read, or delivering eggs from his hens, though the mercantile had plenty. Each visit ended the same way. Jake would walk Rebecca to the mercantile's side door, they would talk for a few more minutes, and then he would tip his hat and leave. He never presumed more, and she found herself both appreciating his respect and wondering what it might be like if he did presume, if he took her hand, or brushed her cheek, or even. Rebecca, are you listening? Martha's voice broke into her thoughts one afternoon in early November. I'm sorry, what did you say? Rebecca asked, flustered. Martha smiled knowingly. I said the winter inventory needs to be completed by next week, but your mind seems to be elsewhere today. Perhaps on a certain rancher who's been finding excuses to visit our store with remarkable frequency lately. Rebecca felt her cheeks grow warm. I don't know what you mean. Of course not, Martha said, her tone gently teasing. Just as I don't notice how Jake Reed has taken to wearing his good shirt on days he comes to town, or how he watches the door whenever he thinks you might walk through it. Does he really? The question slipped out before Rebecca could stop it. Martha laughed softly. Oh, my dear, he most certainly does, and you light up like a lantern whenever that bell jingles and he walks in. She patted Rebecca's hand. It's lovely to see, truly. That Saturday brought the first real snow of the season, wet flakes that began falling mid-morning and quickly accumulated on the ground. Business at the mercantile was brisk as townsfolk hurried to stock up before the weather worsened. By mid-afternoon, the snow was falling so heavily that Mr. Gaines began closing the shutters. We'll close early today, he announced. No sense in staying open if no one can get here. As if to contradict him, the bell jangled and Jake stepped inside, bringing a swirl of snowflakes with him. His coat was dusted white, his hat brim heavy with snow. Jake Reed, what on earth are you doing in town in this weather? Martha exclaimed. Jake stamped snow from his boots. Had to deliver some documents to the land office. Thought I'd stop by before heading back. His eyes found Rebecca across the store, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. You're not planning to ride all the way back to your ranch tonight, are you? George asked incredulously. That's madness in this storm. Plan to stay at the hotel, Jake replied, still looking at Rebecca, if they have a room. As the Gaineses bustled about closing the store, Jake made his way to where Rebecca was organizing the ledger. Hello, she said softly. Hello yourself, he replied, his voice equally quiet. I was hoping to see you before the storm hit. I'm glad you made it safely. Jake glanced toward the window, where snow was now obscuring the view of the street. Barely. Another hour and the trail would have been impassable. A thought struck Rebecca. Will you be able to attend church tomorrow if the snow continues? Jake shook his head regretfully. Not likely. The pass to my ranch drifts badly in snowstorms. Might be a few days before I can get back to town. Disappointment settled in Rebecca's chest. Their Sunday routine had become precious to her, a bright point in a life that had once seemed so uncertain. Rebecca, Jake said suddenly, his voice low and urgent, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. Before he could continue, George called from the front of the store. Jake, if you're heading to the hotel, you'd best go now. It's getting worse by the minute. Jake hesitated, clearly torn. Tomorrow, he said finally. If I can make it to church, I'll ask you tomorrow. But tomorrow came with even heavier snow, and Jake did not appear at church. Nor did he come on Monday or Tuesday as the storm continued unabated, dropping nearly 2 feet of snow on Whispering Pines and the surrounding countryside. By Wednesday, when the clouds finally parted and weak sunshine glinted off the pristine white landscape, Rebecca found herself watching the street anxiously from the mercantile window. The pass will be blocked for days yet, George said gently, noticing her vigilance. Jake's a smart man. He won't try to force it until it's safe. Rebecca nodded, embarrassed to have her feelings so transparent. Of course. I was just wondering how everyone in the outlying areas is faring after such a storm. The next day brought the first customers from outside town, farmers from the valley to the east, where the snow was less severe. By Friday, more people ventured in, but still no one from the western ranches where the mountain pass remained treacherous. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold. Rebecca was arranging a display of woolen mittens when the bell jangled. She looked up, hope rising in her chest, only to see Mrs. Holloway enter, complaining about the cold. Throughout the day, Rebecca's spirits fell as customer after customer arrived, none of them Jake. By closing time, she had resigned herself to another Sunday without him. She was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the store, preparing to close, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. A rider was coming down the street, his horse moving carefully through the rutted, half-frozen snow. Even at a distance, she recognized Jake's broad-shouldered silhouette. Her heart leapt as he drew nearer, guiding his horse directly to the hitching post in front of the mercantile. "Rebecca," he said as he dismounted, his voice rough with what might have been weariness or emotion. "You made it through the pass," she said, unable to keep the happiness from her voice. Jake nodded, securing his horse before approaching her. His face was wind-burned, his eyes tired but bright as they met hers. "Had to cut a trail through 4-foot drifts in places." "That sounds dangerous," Rebecca said, concern tempering her joy at seeing him. "Worth it," Jake replied simply. He glanced at the mercantile door. "Are you closing?" "Yes, we're just finishing up." "Would you walk with me? There's something I need to ask you." Rebecca's pulse quickened. "Let me get my coat." Minutes later, they were strolling through the snow-covered town, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. Jake was uncharacteristically silent, seeming to gather his thoughts. Finally, as they reached the small town square with its snow-laden gazebo, he stopped and turned to face her. "Rebecca, I'm not good with words," he began. "Never have been. Probably why I understood right away that being quiet doesn't mean having nothing to say." Rebecca's heart was pounding so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. "These past weeks, getting to know you," Jake continued, "have been the best of my life. You're thoughtful and kind and stronger than I think you realize." He took a deep breath. "What I'm trying to say is, I care for you deeply, and I wanted to ask if you might consider." He paused, then reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. "If you might consider becoming my wife." Rebecca stared at the box, then at Jake's face, earnest, hopeful, and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "I know it's sudden," he hurried on, "and I don't have Wilcox's fine house or fancy connections. The ranch is modest, and it's a hard life sometimes, but I promise you'd never want for anything I could provide, and I'd spend every day trying to make you happy." Tears filled Rebecca's eyes as Jake opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "My father gave it to her when they decided to move west together, said the pearl reminded him of how something beautiful can come from adversity." Rebecca looked from the ring to Jake's face, seeing in his eyes everything she'd ever hoped to find: respect, understanding, and something deeper that made her heart swell. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Yes, I would be honored to become your wife." Relief and joy transformed Jake's face as he carefully removed the ring from its box. His hands trembled slightly as he slipped it onto her finger, a perfect fit that seemed somehow symbolic of their unexpected connection. For a long moment, they stood looking at each other, snow falling gently around them in the gathering dusk. Then Jake slowly leaned forward, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Rebecca rose on her tiptoes to meet him, and their lips came together in a first kiss that held both tenderness and promise. When they finally drew apart, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. Rebecca smiled, feeling a newfound boldness. "I've been hoping you would." Jake's laugh echoed in the quiet square as he drew her close again, his arms strong and secure around her. They were married 2 weeks later in the small white church where they had sat side by side each Sunday. Martha Gaines helped Rebecca sew a wedding dress of cream-colored wool with lace at the collar and cuffs, while George stood as Jake's best man. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, with Reverend Thompson pronouncing them husband and wife before a congregation that included most of Whispering Pines. Even Harold Wilcox attended, looking somewhat chagrined as he congratulated the radiant bride he had once dismissed. After a wedding dinner at the hotel, Jake drove Rebecca home to the Diamond R in a wagon, loaded with her few possessions and wedding gifts from the townspeople. The journey took most of the afternoon, following a snow-cleared trail that wound through pine forests and across open meadows blanketed in white. As they crested a final hill, Jake pulled the team to a halt. "There it is," he said softly. "Home." Below them stretched a valley cupped by mountains, with a creek winding through its center. Near the creek stood a sturdy log house with smoke curling from its chimney, several outbuildings and corrals where cattle huddled against the cold. "It's beautiful," Rebecca breathed, taking in the pristine landscape gilded by the setting sun. Jake squeezed her hand. "Pete, my foreman, and his wife Maria have been getting the house ready. Maria's been in a frenzy of cleaning and cooking since I told them I was bringing home a bride." As they approached the house, a stocky man with graying hair and a Mexican woman with a kind face emerged onto the porch, waving welcome. "That's them now," Jake said. "Pete's been with me since I bought the place. Maria came along a few years later and straightened him out." He chuckled. "They live in the smaller cabin just beyond the barn." The welcome was warm, with Maria embracing Rebecca like a long-lost daughter while Pete pumped Jake's hand and clapped him on the back. After helping unload the wagon, the older couple discreetly withdrew to their own cabin, leaving the newlyweds to settle into their home. Inside, Rebecca discovered a house far more comfortable than she had imagined. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace, a solid table with chairs, and a pair of well-worn but clean armchairs. A door led to a bedroom with a four-poster bed covered in a colorful quilt, and beside it, a smaller room that Jake explained had once been his office but could someday be a nursery, perhaps. The suggestion brought a blush to Rebecca's cheeks and a softness to Jake's eyes that made her heart race. That night, as they sat before the fire after a supper of Maria's stew and fresh bread, Jake took Rebecca's hand in his. "Happy?" he asked simply. Rebecca nodded, the contentment she felt too deep for many words. "Very, are you?" Jake's answer was to draw her into his arms, his kiss conveying everything words could not. The winter passed in a blur of discovery of each other, of their new life together. Rebecca learned the rhythms of ranch life. The early mornings when Jake would rise before dawn to check on cattle or mend fences damaged by snow and wind, the peaceful evenings when they would read aloud to each other by lamplight, the satisfaction of keeping their home warm and welcoming. Jake, in turn, discovered the joy of coming home to someone who understood his silences, who could read his moods in the set of his shoulders, who never demanded more words than he had to give but treasured those he offered. They established their own routines and traditions. Sunday mornings were still reserved for church when weather permitted, followed by dinner in town and visits with the Gainasees. When snow made the journey impossible, they held their own simple service at home, reading from the Bible and singing hymns as best they could. Maria taught Rebecca to make tortillas and spicy stews, while Pete showed her how to identify the ranch's cattle by their markings. Jake expanded the kitchen garden as the ground thawed in spring, adding the flowers Rebecca had always wanted alongside the practical vegetables. Their first disagreement came in late winter when Rebecca announced her intention to ride with Jake to check on a group of cattle stranded by a late snowstorm. "It's too dangerous," Jake insisted. "The north pasture is rough country even in good weather." "I've been practicing my riding all winter," Rebecca countered. "And you said yourself that you could use another pair of eyes to spot strays." "Rebecca, Jake Reed," she interrupted, her quiet voice surprisingly firm. "I did not come all the way from Boston and marry a rancher to sit by the fire while he has all the adventures. I want to be your partner in this life, not just your housekeeper." Jake stared at her, momentarily taken aback by this assertion from his usually agreeable wife. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. "You're right," he conceded, "but you'll wear my heavy coat and take the most reliable horse." Rebecca beamed, sealing their reconciliation with a kiss that nearly made Jake forget about the cattle altogether. Spring brought new life to the diamond, our calves wobbling alongside their mothers in the greening pastures, wildflowers dotting the meadows, and the creek running high with snowmelt. Rebecca threw herself into ranch life with unexpected enthusiasm, proving herself not only capable but invaluable. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Rebecca took Jake's hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "I think," she said softly, "we might need that nursery sooner rather than later." Jake's face transformed with wonder as he understood her meaning. "You're certain?" Rebecca nodded, her eyes shining. "Maria suspected first. She's been through it enough times to recognize the signs. But I waited until I was sure before telling you." Jake gathered her into his arms, his usual reserve giving way to unrestrained joy as he lifted her off her feet and spun her around on the porch, both of them laughing in the golden light. Later that night, as they lay together in the darkness, Jake's hand resting protectively over the place where their child grew, he whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" Rebecca asked, nestling closer to his warmth. "For answering that advertisement, for not giving up when Wilcox was a fool. For sitting beside me in church all those Sundays, even when I hardly said a word." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "For finding me." Rebecca smiled in the darkness, thinking of the shy, uncertain woman who had stepped off the train in Whispering Pines nearly a year ago. How far she had come from that day, not because she had fundamentally changed, but because she had found someone who valued her exactly as she was. "I think," she said softly, "we found each other." On a bright September day, as golden aspen leaves danced in the autumn breeze, Rebecca gave birth to a daughter they named Rose Martha Reed. Pete and Maria served as godparents at the christening, with the Gaineses traveling from town to join the celebration. "She has your eyes," Jake said wonderingly as he cradled his daughter, her tiny hand wrapped around his finger. "And hopefully your gentle spirit. And your strength," Rebecca added, watching her husband and child with a heart so full it seemed impossible to contain such happiness. As Rose grew from infant to toddler to spirited young girl, Rebecca sometimes marveled at how completely her life had transformed. The small room above the mercantile had been replaced by a home that had expanded along with their family, a second bedroom added when Rose was 2. A larger kitchen when Rebecca began preserving fruits and vegetables in quantities that surprised even Maria, a proper office for Jake as the ranch prospered under their joint care. They added to their family again when Rose was 4, a son they named James George, who had Jake's quiet thoughtfulness and Rebecca's love of books. And 2 years later, another daughter, Emma, completed their family with her infectious laugh and boundless energy. Through the years, Rebecca and Jake maintained their Sunday tradition, attending church in Whispering Pines whenever possible, though now with children beside them in the pew. The townsfolk who had once whispered about the shy mail-order bride and the taciturn rancher now pointed to them as an example of a marriage that worked in perfect harmony, 2 people who complemented each other's strengths and understood each other's silences. 10 years after their wedding, on a crisp December evening as they sat by the fire watching their children play on the rug before them, Jake took Rebecca's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming west? Marrying me instead of someone like Wilcox who could have given you a fancier life?" Rebecca looked at him in surprise. "Never, not for a single moment." She squeezed his hand. "Why would you ask such a thing?" Jake shrugged, a hint of his old reticence returning. "Overheard Mrs. Holloway in town yesterday telling someone how you could have done better than a plain cattle rancher." Rebecca's laugh was soft but genuine. Mrs. Holloway wouldn't recognize true happiness if it served her special English tea. She moved closer to him on the sofa, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched Rose help little Emma build a tower of wooden blocks while James quietly read in the corner, so like his father. "I came west looking for a new life," Rebecca said thoughtfully. "I thought it would be as Harold Wilcox's wife, hosting dinner parties and managing a grand house. Instead, I found something far more precious, a man who saw value in my quietness, who gave me space to find my voice, who built a life with me based on understanding and respect." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I didn't do better than you, Jake Reed. I did exactly right." Jake's kiss was as tender as their first had been that snowy evening in the town square, a renewal of promises kept and a pledge of years still to come. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the Diamond R in pristine white, as the family gathered close in the warmth of the home they had built together, a quiet man, a shy woman, and the love that had given them both the courage to speak their hearts.